She isn't attractive enough for you anymore, and she never has time for you. But I am fully available for you.
She stood in her own driveway on a gray Tuesday morning, keys pressed so hard into her palm they left a mark, staring at a front door she had painted herself 12 years earlier, a door that no longer opened to her touch. Inside, she could hear her daughter's laughter, muffled through the glass, answering to a voice that was not her own. This is the story of Adalyn Marsh, a woman who welcomed a stranger into her home to save her family, and watched that stranger become the reason her family nearly came apart at the seams. What happened inside that house over the following year would test everything Adalyn believed about trust, about marriage, and about how far another person will go to take what was never theirs to take. Before we go back to where it all began, understand this much. Everything you are about to hear started with a single act of kindness, one Adalyn would spend years trying to undo. 3 years before that morning in the driveway, none of it seemed possible. Adalyn would have laughed if you told her that hiring help around the house would cost her the house itself. She would have told you that Adalyn Marsh was the steadiest man she knew, the kind who fixed other people's homes for a living and never once let his own fall apart. She would have told you her children were safe, her marriage was solid, and her biggest worry was getting dinner on the table by 6. This is how it always starts, not with a warning, not with a raised voice or a slammed door. It starts quietly, with someone walking through the front door because you invited her in, and it ends with you standing outside that same door, locked out of the only life you ever wanted. Thornwood, Tennessee, is the kind of town where front porches face the street on purpose, where neighbors wave from lawnmowers and everyone assumes they already know everyone else's story. The Marsh family had lived there for 3 generations, and for a long time, their story looked exactly like every other family's story on that street. But 3 questions would come to define what happened to Adalyn, Weston, and their children over the year that followed. How does a woman hired to help a struggling household end up owning it? Why did a husband, who once seemed devoted, stop noticing that his wife was disappearing right in front of him? And when the systems meant to protect a family seemed to side against the person telling the truth, what is left to fight with? These 3 questions sit at the center of everything you are about to hear. Before we get into how it all unraveled, please support this channel by letting us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next in this quiet Tennessee town is a warning most people never see coming until it is already living inside their own house. When Priscilla Duvain first arrived at the Marsh home for her interview, she carried no written references. No former employer ever answered the phone when Adalyn tried to call the numbers on her application. And still, without fully understanding why, Adalyn hired her that very same afternoon, relieved to finally have help, never once imagining what that relief would eventually cost her. To understand how far things fell, you have to understand how high they once stood. Weston Marsh had built his contracting business from a single pickup truck and a toolbox he inherited from his father, growing it over 15 years into the most trusted name in Thornwood for anyone who needed a roof repaired or a kitchen rebuilt. He was known around town as a man of his word, the kind of contractor who showed up when he said he would and charged exactly what he quoted. Adalyn had met him at a church fundraiser when she was 24, and within 2 years they were married in the same small chapel where his parents had married decades before. By the time this story begins, they had 2 children, a modest but comfortable home on Larkspur Lane, and a marriage that most people in town pointed to as proof that good things still happened to good people. Adalyn managed the household with the same quiet competence she brought to her part-time bookkeeping job at a local accounting firm, balancing spreadsheets by day and school pickups by afternoon. Their son, Sawyer, was 16 and already talking about following his father into the trade, spending weekends learning to frame walls and mix concrete. Their daughter, Junie, was 9, small and freckled, rarely seen without the stuffed rabbit she had carried since her second birthday. Life on Larkspur Lane moved at the unremarkable pace of a family that had simply figured things out, and for a long time, that was enough. Nobody in that house was looking for trouble, and nobody suspected that trouble was capable of arriving disguised as help. The cracks began the way cracks usually do, quietly and far from where anyone was looking. Adalyn's mother, who lived 2 towns over in Millport, was diagnosed with a heart condition that required frequent visits and eventually a level of care Adalyn could not provide from a distance. Weeks turned into a pattern of Adalyn driving 40 minutes each way several times a week, splitting herself between her mother's bedside and her own children's dinner table, running on less sleep than she would ever admit to Weston. The bookkeeping job suffered. The house grew quietly untidy in ways Adalyn used to control effortlessly. By the 3rd month of this routine, Adalyn was exhausted in a way that sleep no longer fixed, and it was Weston, trying to be helpful, who first raised the idea of hiring someone to help around the house. Adalyn resisted at first. She had never been the kind of woman who let strangers into her private life, and the idea of paying someone to do what she felt she should be doing herself sat uneasily with her. But after a night where she fell asleep at the kitchen table before finishing Junie's permission slip, she relented. She posted a listing for part-time household help, expecting to interview 2 or 3 candidates from the church directory or the community board at the grocery store. Instead, on the 2nd day the listing was up, a woman named Priscilla Duvain called, said she had just moved to Thornwood from out of state, and asked if she could come by that same afternoon. Adalyn, worn down and desperate for relief, said yes without thinking twice. Priscilla arrived at the Marsh home, dressed plainly, but with an unmistakable polish underneath it, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her manner calm and unhurried in a way that immediately put Adalyn at ease. She spoke warmly about children, mentioned experience with 2 prior families without naming them, and answered every question with just enough detail to sound credible and just enough vagueness to avoid being checked. Adalyn tried calling the 2 references Priscilla provided. One number rang without answer for 3 days straight. The other belonged to a disconnected line. Adalyn mentioned this to Weston that evening, half expecting him to share her hesitation. Instead, he shrugged it off, reminding her how badly they needed the help, and by the end of the week, Priscilla Duvain had a key to the Marsh family home. Estelle Marsh, Weston's mother, had her own opinion of the new arrangement, one she voiced plainly during a Sunday dinner not long after Priscilla was hired. Estelle had buried a husband of her own and raised Weston largely on her own resilience, and she carried a sharpness about her that most people in Thornwood had learned to respect rather than argue with. She told Adalyn directly, over dishes that evening, that a household should never run more smoothly with a stranger in it than it did with the people who built it, and that Adalyn ought to trust that instinct even if she couldn't yet explain it. Adalyn appreciated the concern, but chalked it up, as she had with Beatrice, to an older woman's natural caution around anything new. She would not fully understand how right Estelle had been until nearly a year later. It was Beatrice Holt, Adalyn's closest friend since high school, who first voiced the unease that Adalyn herself was too tired to fully feel. Beatrice met Priscilla only once, at a spring cookout on Larkspur Lane, and pulled Adalyn aside within the hour to say something felt off about the new hire, though she couldn't yet put her finger on exactly what. Adalyn brushed it aside, chalking it up to Beatrice's protective nature and her own relief at finally having help around the house. Priscilla, for her part, seemed almost eager to be liked, complimenting Adalyn's cooking, praising Weston's work ethic, and telling Junie bedtime stories with a warmth that made the little girl light up every time Priscilla's car pulled into the driveway. For the first few weeks, the arrangement looked like exactly what Adalyn had hoped for, a burden lifted, nothing more. But warmth, given without reason, is worth watching closely. Within a month, Priscilla had learned the family's routines with a precision that went beyond simple attentiveness. She knew Weston took his coffee black before 6 and with cream after, without ever being told twice. She knew which nights Sawyer had practice and which nights Junie needed help with spelling words, and she positioned herself to be present for exactly those moments Adalyn was too stretched to cover herself. She became, in the span of weeks, not an addition to the household, but a quiet fixture inside it, the kind of presence people stop noticing precisely because it has made itself so useful. Adalyn, driving back and forth to Millport twice a week, was grateful. She had no way of knowing gratitude was the exact door Priscilla had been counting on walking through. 2 small moments that spring would later feel, in hindsight, impossible to ignore, though at the time Adalyn let both slip past her. The first came when Junie mentioned, almost in passing while brushing her teeth, that Priscilla had told her a secret she wasn't supposed to share with her mother. When Adalyn gently pressed, Junie simply said she'd promised not to tell, and changed the subject to something about her stuffed rabbit. The second came a few weeks later, when Adalyn found a grocery notepad on the kitchen counter covered in handwriting that wasn't hers, practicing what looked unmistakably like her own signature, over and over, in the margins beside a shopping list for milk and bread. Adalyn stared at that page for a long moment before telling herself it meant nothing at all. By early summer, the household had settled into a new rhythm, one that ran smoothly on the surface, while something else moved quietly beneath it. Weston, who had always come home for dinner, even during his busiest stretches at the business, began staying later at the office, telling Adalyn he was buried in paperwork for a string of new contracts. Priscilla, who had originally been hired for a few afternoons a week, gradually became a near-constant presence, offering to stay later, to handle more, to take one more thing off Adalyn's plate. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody drew a line that could be pointed to later as the moment things changed. It simply happened the way water finds its way into a foundation, slowly, invisibly, until the damage was already structural. It is worth saying plainly that what unfolded between Weston and Priscilla cannot be reduced to a single simple explanation, and this story will not pretend otherwise. There are 2 ways to read what happened next, and the honest truth may contain pieces of both. One version says, Priscilla arrived already intending to take what belonged to another woman, patient and deliberate in every kind word she offered. The other version says, Weston, quietly overwhelmed and increasingly unseen in his own home, allowed himself to be flattered by attention he should have redirected back toward his marriage. What can be said for certain is only this. Praise filled the exact gaps that exhaustion had opened in Adalyn's marriage, and Priscilla was the one standing there to offer it, night after night, while Adalyn was 30 minutes away at her mother's bedside. The late nights over paperwork became a pattern Adalyn barely registered as unusual, in part because Priscilla was often still in the house when Weston finally came home, finishing dishes or folding laundry, making the late hour feel less like an absence and more like everyone simply working hard together. Adalyn, returning from Millport after difficult evenings with her mother, found comfort rather than suspicion in walking into a clean kitchen and settled children. She thanked Priscilla often, meant it every time, and had no reason yet to imagine that the woman she was thanking was slowly rearranging the emotional architecture of her marriage. Weston, for his part, began confiding in Priscilla about small frustrations he used to bring only to Adalyn, the slow drip of intimacy redirecting itself one ordinary conversation at a time. The first sign Adalyn could not simply reason away came after a full week spent almost entirely at her mother's bedside, a stretch during which her mother's condition had worsened enough to require Adalyn's stay overnight in Millport twice. When she finally returned home, worn thin and desperate to collapse into her own bed, she noticed the small territorial shifts a house undergoes when someone new has quietly claimed it as her own. The living room furniture had been rearranged in a layout Adalyn had never chosen. Her grandmother's recipe cards, kept for years in a specific tin on the counter, had been replaced with a folder of Priscilla's own printed recipes. Even her seat at the dinner table, the one she had occupied for a decade, now seemed to belong, without discussion, to someone else. Adalyn said nothing that first night, telling herself she was too tired to trust her own perception of things. That likely meant nothing at all. But 2 nights later, walking past the kitchen doorway, on her way to check on Junie, she caught a look pass between Weston and Priscilla, brief and wordless, the kind of look that carries an entire private history inside a single second. She stopped in the hallway, certain of what she had seen, and immediately unsure of how to name it. When she raised it with Weston later that night, he grew defensive almost instantly, insisting she was imagining things, telling her the stress of her mother's illness was making her see problems that did not exist. Adalyn wanted, more than anything, to believe him. For a while, she tried. She told herself that a marriage built over a decade did not simply dissolve because of one uneasy glance in a kitchen doorway. She threw herself back into her routines, kept driving to Millport, kept thanking Priscilla for her help, kept choosing to trust the man she had built a life with, rather than a feeling she could not fully prove. But trust, once punctured, rarely holds water the way it used to. Small details Adalyn had let pass now returned to her in the quiet hours before sleep. The signature practiced on a grocery notepad, Junie's secret she wasn't allowed to share. The coffee Priscilla poured black before 6 without ever being told. Individually, each detail was nothing. Together, they had begun to form a shape Adalyn was not yet ready to look at directly. The moment that finally forced her to look came almost by accident. On an ordinary Thursday, when Weston asked her to grab something from his truck before he left for a job site. Reaching into the glove compartment for a set of keys, Adalyn's hand instead found a second phone, one she had never seen before, tucked beneath a stack of invoices. It was unlocked. She should have put it back. Instead, standing alone in the driveway, with her children inside the house, Adalyn opened the most recent message thread and read a name she recognized instantly, followed by 7 words that rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. She's starting to notice. We need to move faster. Adalyn stood frozen in the driveway for a long moment, the phone trembling slightly in her hand, before she finally understood that the danger in her home had never been coming. It had already arrived. She did not confront anyone that afternoon. Instead, she drove to the end of the street, parked beneath an old oak tree she had passed 1,000 times without ever really seeing it, and sat with the weight of those 7 words until her hands finally stopped shaking. She thought about her mother in Millport, too fragile to be told any of this yet. She thought about Sawyer, old enough to sense that something in the house had shifted, even if he couldn't name it, and Junie, still young enough to believe every adult in her life was exactly who they claimed to be. Adalyn understood, sitting alone in that driver's seat, that whatever came next would not simply be about her marriage anymore. It would be about how much of her family's foundation she could still manage to protect. Adalyn confronted Weston that same night, the second phone laid flat on the kitchen table between them like evidence in a trial neither of them had asked to attend. She expected denial, or anger, or at the very least, some flicker of shame. What she received instead was a coldness she had never once seen from him in 12 years of marriage. He did not deny the messages. He simply stopped defending himself, as though the effort of maintaining the marriage had already quietly ended somewhere she hadn't been present for. Within days, he told her plainly that he no longer believed the marriage could be saved, framing the failure not as his own betrayal, but as the natural result of a wife who had been too distracted, too absent, too consumed by her mother's illness to hold their family together. Adalyn sat across from him, stunned by how thoroughly the blame had been redirected onto her. What happened next was, in its own way, more disorienting than the affair itself. Rather than being asked to leave, Priscilla Duvain was instead invited to stay, framed by Weston as a stabilizing presence for the children during what he called a difficult transition. She moved her belongings into the guest room down the hall from Sawyer and Junie's bedrooms. Within the same week, Adalyn discovered the second phone, a decision made without Adalyn's input and delivered to her as something already settled. Adalyn found herself living inside her own home as something closer to a guest than an owner, watching a woman who had shattered her marriage tuck her children into bed each night while she lay awake down the hall, unable to fully process how quickly the ground beneath her had shifted. It was in the weeks that followed that Adalyn began noticing irregularities far more troubling than a rearranged living room. Reviewing the household finances she had once managed without a second thought, she found bank accounts she did not recognize, statements addressed to her but never seen by her, and a folder in Weston's desk containing a power of attorney document granting significant financial authority over shared property. The signature on that document was hers, in her own handwriting, on a paper she had absolutely no memory of signing. She thought immediately of the grocery notepad she had found months earlier, the one covered in careful, repeated practice of her own name, and felt something cold settle in her chest as the pieces began, slowly and unwillingly, to arrange themselves into a picture she did not want to see. Beatrice Holt became, in this period, the one steady presence Adalyn could lean on without qualification. She showed up at the house unannounced with coffee and a legal pad, sat with Adalyn at the kitchen table for hours, going through every document, every date, every inconsistency, refusing to let her friend convince herself she was simply overreacting to grief and exhaustion. It was Beatrice who first said aloud what Adalyn had been too afraid to fully consider, that this no longer looked like the ordinary unraveling of a marriage under strain, but something closer to a plan, executed patiently over months by someone who had walked into the house with intentions far beyond household chores. Beatrice was also the one who insisted Adalyn stop trying to handle it alone and call an attorney. Roland Pruitt had handled small legal matters for families in Thornwood for over 20 years, mostly wills and property disputes, the quiet, unglamorous work of a small-town practice. When Adalyn brought him the forged power of attorney and laid out the timeline of the previous months, he listened without interrupting, then asked a question that would change the direction of everything that followed. He asked whether Adalyn knew anything at all about Priscilla Duvain's life before Thornwood. Adalyn realized, sitting in his office, that she had never truly known. No verified references, no prior employer who would answer a phone. A woman who had appeared in their lives fully formed, capable, and warm, and who Adalyn now understood she had let into her home on almost nothing but instinct and exhaustion. Even Sawyer, 16 and increasingly wary of Priscilla's presence in the house he'd grown up in, ended up contributing an unexpected piece to the puzzle. Looking through a stack of mail that had been left on the kitchen counter, he found an old pay stub addressed to Priscilla under a different last name entirely, tied to a job in a town nearly 200 miles away. He brought it to his mother without fully understanding its significance, only knowing it felt wrong that the woman living down the hall from his sister's bedroom had apparently gone by another name somewhere else, for reasons no one in the house could explain. Adalyn handed the pay stub to Roland Pruitt the following morning, and something in his expression told her this detail mattered more than she yet understood. Roland spent the following 2 weeks quietly working the phones, tracing the name on that pay stub back through employment records and county filings, the kind of unglamorous investigative work most people never see depicted in the movies, but which forms the backbone of every real legal case. What he found stopped him cold. Priscilla Duvain, under the name printed on that old pay stub, had worked as live-in household help for another family roughly 3 years earlier, in a town on the other side of the state. That family, like the Marshes, had experienced a sudden and disorienting collapse of their marriage during her employment. That case, Roland discovered, had been quietly resolved outside of court, the details sealed under a settlement neither party had ever spoken publicly about. Roland brought this discovery to Adalyn on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, laying the timeline out across her kitchen table with the same careful patience Beatrice had shown weeks earlier. A pattern was forming, one far larger and more deliberate than a single family's private heartbreak. Adalyn sat with the information for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her, exhaustion giving way, slowly, to a kind of clarity she hadn't felt in months. She was no longer simply the wife of a man who had strayed. She was, potentially, the second known target of a woman who had done this before, successfully enough that she had walked away from it once already, with money and a clean legal record. Adalyn asked Roland one question. How do we find the family it happened to first? Roland warned her that the previous family's settlement likely included a confidentiality clause that would make them reluctant, possibly legally unable, to speak openly about what had happened. Adalyn insisted on trying anyway, and after several attempts through public records and a mutual contact Roland's office was able to locate, a woman named Carolyn Whitmore agreed to a phone call, on the condition that nothing she said would be used publicly without her permission. What Carolyn described over that call mirrored Adalyn's experience with an accuracy that left no room for coincidence. The same slow entrenchment into daily routines, the same forged financial documents, the same quiet insistence on staying even after the affair was exposed. By the end of that phone call, Adalyn finally understood she was not simply fighting to save her marriage. She was fighting to stop this from happening to the next family after hers. With Carolyn Whitmore's account, now corroborating what Roland had uncovered independently, the shape of the situation had changed entirely. This was no longer a private, domestic collapse, to be quietly absorbed and grieved. It was, potentially, a documented pattern of financial fraud, carried out against at least 2 families under at least 2 different names. Roland began preparing formal documentation, gathering signatures, dates, and forged paperwork into a case file that grew thicker by the week. Weston, when finally confronted with Carolyn's story and the pay stub bearing Priscilla's other name, went quiet in a way Adalyn hadn't seen from him before, the first crack in a confidence that had otherwise remained infuriatingly intact since the second phone first appeared on that kitchen table months earlier. It was in the final days of gathering this evidence that Roland uncovered the detail that turned a slow-building case into an emergency. Buried within the forged power of attorney was language broad enough to authorize the sale of real property, and a record search revealed that paperwork had already been filed to list the Marsh family home for sale, with closing scheduled for less than 2 weeks away. Adalyn read the filing date twice, certain she had misunderstood, before the reality settled fully into place. The house on Larkspur Lane, the one she had painted, raised her children in, and stood locked outside of, on that gray Tuesday morning that opened this story, was days away from being sold out from under her, without her knowledge or consent, by a signature that had never truly belonged to her at all. Estelle Marsh, once she learned how far things had actually gone, did not hold back her fury, directing most of it at her own son for allowing a stranger to gain that much control over a home 3 generations of the family had lived in. But she also did something more useful than anger. She offered to move in temporarily, taking over meals and school pickups, so that Adalyn could spend every waking hour working with Roland instead of managing the household alone. It was a small, practical gift, but it mattered enormously in those final desperate weeks. One more person in Adalyn's corner, refusing to let exhaustion be the reason this ended badly. For the first time since the second phone appeared on the kitchen table, Adalyn felt something close to an army forming quietly around her. With the sale of the house now bearing down on a fixed date, Roland Pruitt shifted from careful investigation into urgent action, compiling every document, every corroborating detail from Carolyn Whitmore, and the forged power of attorney itself into a single case file meant to freeze the sale before closing. What emerged from that file, laid out in full for the first time, was a portrait of Priscilla Duvain, far more calculated than anyone in the Marsh household had allowed themselves to imagine. She had, according to the pattern now visible across 2 families in 2 different towns, a method she followed with unsettling consistency, presenting herself as indispensable help to an overwhelmed household, gradually isolating the wife through exhaustion and distance, redirecting the husband's attention and trust, and ultimately maneuvering toward financial control over shared property before disappearing with a settlement large enough to fund her next arrival somewhere new. Carolyn Whitmore, once assured her identity would remain protected, agreed to put her account in writing, providing Roland with a sworn statement describing almost the exact sequence of events Adalyn had lived through, down to small, unnerving details, the memorized coffee order, the quiet replacement of household routines, even a forged signature practiced in the margins of a grocery list. Reading Carolyn's statement for the first time, Adalyn felt an emotion she hadn't expected amid all the anger and heartbreak, something closer to grief for a stranger she had never met, a woman 200 miles away who had lived through the identical betrayal and been left with no recourse but silence and a sealed settlement. The 2 women, connected only by the same name on 2 different forged documents, spoke by phone again that week, and for the first time since this began, Adalyn did not feel alone in it. Adalyn made the decision, against Roland's cautious advice about confrontation before all the paperwork was filed, to speak with Priscilla directly one final time. She found her in the kitchen on an ordinary evening, calmly preparing dinner in the house that was, on paper, no longer entirely Adalyn's to claim. Adalyn laid Carolyn Whitmore's name on the counter between them without preamble, watching for the first time in nearly a year as Priscilla's carefully maintained composure genuinely faltered. There was no confession, not fully, but there was a long silence where the practiced warmth simply fell away, replaced by something colder and more calculating, an expression Adalyn recognized instantly as the true face that had been hidden beneath the bedtime stories and the memorized coffee orders since the very first afternoon she walked through the front door. Weston, present for that confrontation, heard the full scope of what Roland and Carolyn's account had uncovered, for the first time laid out plainly in his own kitchen, and something in him seemed to finally break through the fog that had settled over him for the better part of a year. This story will not pretend his reckoning arrived as a clean redemption, because it did not. He did not immediately turn to Adalyn with tears and apologies. He stood mostly silent, visibly working through the recognition that he had been maneuvered as thoroughly as his wife had, his confidence in his own judgment crumbling in real time as he understood how completely he had allowed himself to be managed by someone he'd trusted with his family's most private moments. In the days following that confrontation, Priscilla's behavior shifted from calm confidence to visible urgency, and Roland's office confirmed what they had feared. that paperwork tied to the forged power of attorney was moving through the final stages required to transfer the property before the scheduled closing date. Every day now carried real weight. Adalyn found herself living inside a countdown she hadn't chosen, aware that the home she had spent over a decade building could legally change hands within a matter of days unless Roland's emergency filing succeeded in time. Sleep became difficult. Even Beatrice, normally the steadiest presence in the room, admitted over coffee one morning that she was frightened for her friend, in a way she hadn't expressed before, watching Adalyn hold together a household that was, quite literally, being sold out from beneath her. It was Junie, small and usually quiet, through the tension that had settled over the house all year, who provided an unexpected final piece of clarity during this period. She told her mother, without prompting, about the secret Priscilla had asked her to keep so many months earlier, finally comfortable enough to break the promise now that she sensed something was deeply wrong. The secret, as it turned out, was smaller than Adalyn had feared and larger than she expected. Priscilla had asked Junie to tell her, whenever her mother mentioned being tired or overwhelmed, so that Priscilla would always know exactly when to step in and be helpful. A child's innocent compliance, Adalyn realized, had been quietly used as a monitoring system for over a year. One more thread in a pattern that had been more calculated than anyone in the house had allowed themselves to believe. Adalyn held Junie close that night longer than usual, careful not to let her own anger show in front of a 9-year-old who had simply done what she believed was being kind. She explained gently that Junie had done nothing wrong, that grown-ups sometimes ask children to help in ways that aren't fair to ask, and that telling the truth now, even late, was the bravest possible thing she could have done. It was a small moment in the middle of a much larger unraveling, but it stayed with Adalyn long after the case itself was resolved. A reminder that the people Priscilla Duvain had manipulated most completely were not always the adults in the room. With the closing date now only days away, Roland Pruett filed an emergency motion in county court, presenting the forged power of attorney alongside Carolyn Whitmore's sworn statement and the matching pattern of behavior documented across both households. The judge, reviewing the filing on short notice, granted a temporary injunction freezing the sale of the Larkspur Lane property less than 72 hours before it was scheduled to close. Adalyn received the call from Roland's office while standing in the same driveway where this story began, and for the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself to sit down on the front steps of her own home and simply breathe. The weight of the countdown finally lifted, even as she understood the fight itself was far from fully over. In the weeks that followed, the fuller picture of Priscilla Duvain's history came into public view. First through the county filings, tied to the injunction, then through Carolyn Whitmore's willingness to finally speak openly once the earlier settlement's confidentiality terms became less relevant to a broader fraud investigation. Facing formal charges tied to both households, Priscilla ultimately left Thornwood before the case reached a full trial, accepting a plea that included restitution and a permanent record, but, to Adalyn's frustration, not the extended prison sentence many in town felt the situation deserved. It was not the clean, satisfying justice often promised in stories like this one. It was smaller, quieter, and in its own way, more honest about how these situations actually resolve in real life. Imperfect, but sufficient to end the pattern. Weston's path forward proved similarly imperfect, and this story will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. He did not win Adalyn back, and by the time the injunction was granted, both of them understood the marriage itself had already ended in every way that mattered. What he did do, in the months that followed, was work seriously to rebuild what remained salvageable, testifying honestly on Roland's behalf regarding the timeline of events, acknowledging publicly and directly to his children the role his own choices had played in what happened to their family, and slowly earning back a version of trust with Sawyer and Junie built on consistency rather than apology alone. It was not redemption in the way audiences sometimes want, complete and immediate. It was smaller, ongoing, and still being written. For Adalyn, the resolution arrived less as a single triumphant moment and more as a gradual return of ground she had once assumed was permanently lost. The injunction held. The forged documents were formally invalidated by the court. The house on Larkspur Lane remained legally hers, and in the months that followed, she began the quiet work of making it feel like hers again, in every sense, not as a return to the marriage that had once filled its rooms, but as the foundation of a new life she was building with her children on her own terms. Beatrice Holt remained by her side through every step of that rebuilding, and Roland Pruitt's careful, unglamorous legal work had, in the end, been the thing that made all of it possible. On an ordinary evening some months later, Adalyn stood in her own kitchen again, the same kitchen where she had once found handwriting practicing her signature on a grocery notepad, now filled with nothing more remarkable than the sound of dinner being made and her children doing homework at the table. Junie walked in holding the stuffed rabbit she had carried since her second birthday, the same one Priscilla had once suggested, gently but pointedly, that Junie was getting too old to keep. Junie set it on the counter beside her mother without a word, and Adalyn understood the gesture for exactly what it was, small proof that despite everything, the core of what mattered in this family had survived intact. She picked the rabbit up, set it back in Junie's arms, and returned to making dinner in a house that finally, fully, belonged to her again. What this story leaves behind, more than any single twist or reveal, is a quieter kind of caution worth sitting with. Trust is not a mistake. Adalyn was not wrong to want help during one of the hardest seasons of her life, and there is no version of this story where needing support makes a person foolish. What matters is the space between trust and vigilance, the understanding that kindness offered freely by a stranger still deserves the same questions any of us would ask before handing over a key. Priscilla Duvain counted on exhaustion to lower every guard in that house, and for a long time it worked exactly as she intended. It stopped working only when the people who loved Adalyn most, a sharp-eyed friend, a patient attorney, a teenage son, and a 9-year-old holding onto a secret she wasn't supposed to share, refused to stop paying attention. So here is the question worth sitting with as this story closes. Looking back at everything Adalyn missed in those early months, the memorized coffee order, the handwriting on the grocery notepad, the secret her daughter wasn't allowed to share, would you have noticed the pattern sooner than she did? Or is it only ever obvious from the outside, looking back, once every piece has already fallen into place? There is no wrong answer here, only an honest one, and we would genuinely love to hear which details stood out to you first. If this story stayed with you, know that it is far from the only one like it we have found. Families across this country have lived through quieter versions of exactly what happened to Adalyn Marsh, and in the coming weeks, we will be sharing more of these stories, each one a reminder of how easily trust can be tested by the people we least expect to test it. Thank you for staying with Adalyn's story all the way to the end. If it moved you, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring you. There are more families, more houses, and more quiet warnings still waiting to be told.